Hola! Welcome to another Spanish lesson with Senor Geis. In this video, we're going to be talking about the differences between the preterite tense and the imperfect tense in Spanish. This is a fascinating and in many ways nuanced concept that can be a little bit foreign to those of us whose native language is English. So we're going to be dedicating a few different videos to learning how to appropriately use both of these tenses. Before you really dive into what the difference between the tenses is, you should make sure that you know what the tenses are. And when I say that, I mean you should be able to conjugate them and recognize them as the tense that they are. So when you're conjugating regular preterite tense verbs that end in AR, you're going to use these endings. When you're conjugating regular verbs that end in ER in the preterite tense, you're going to be using these endings. Whereas if you're conjugating regular verbs that end in AR in the imperfect tense, you're going to use these endings, and you're going to use these endings for verbs that end in ER and IR when conjugating them in the imperfect tense. So if you're not familiar with these conjugations, I would suggest you go back and review that and make sure you're really solid on that before you continue with these videos. So, if you know exactly what I'm talking about, then let's dive into it. So the preterite tense and the imperfect tense are both past tenses. And that means that whatever we're talking about using these tenses happen in the past. We're talking about things that happened in the past, not things that happen now or things that will happen. So that's the similarity between both of these tenses. They're past tense verbs. But the difference is what we call linguistically in aspect. And a simple way of saying that is that you're looking at how the verb is being perceived. So even though they're both in the past tense, when you're conjugating verbs in the preterite tense, you're talking about events that were whole or limited. And when I say limited, I mean kind of more specific and bounded in time at a specific time. Many people will say that these are completed events, although that's not necessarily always true. And to contrast with that, we have the imperfect tense, which still happens in the past, but we're describing events that were ongoing or habitual. And you'll see the word habit in that word habitual, and we'll get to that in a second. So a good way to approach this from the get-go is to look at how they're translated. So preterite tense, you're pretty much always going to translate by just using the simple past tense, which in English often means that your verb is ending in the letters ed. So if you take a verb conjugated in the preterite tense, like yo caminé, which means I walked, that's pretty much the best way you can translate this. And that I think will help you with understanding when to use it. However, when you're using the imperfect tense, there are a couple other ways you can translate the tense. So you can translate verbs conjugated in the imperfect tense with that simple ed ending, but you can also translate them by using the phrase was or were doing something. Focus on that ing ending on a verb. So dancing, singing, writing, things that were happening. Or using the phrase used to or would before a verb. So if you take that same verb, caminar, and conjugate it in the imperfect tense, yo caminaba, you could translate it as I walked, but you would be implying that you walked frequently, or that you were walking. I was walking, yo caminaba, or I used to walk. So let's get into some more specific examples, and these are going to be pretty general, but they are a good rule to follow. So the preterite tense you're going to generally use for single events. So for example, la gata comió el pescado. The cat ate the fish. That's a single event. Versus using the imperfect tense, you will talk about habits. And if we take that same sentence and say, la gata comía muchos pescados, you would be saying the cat used to eat a lot of fish. So we're not talking about a specific instance of a cat eating fish, just we're saying that it was a habit or something that the cat did over and over again. Going back to the preterite tense, you will use it for events that happened in a sequence, when you're emphasizing that things happened one after another. So you could say, tú hiciste la tarea, jugaste videojuegos y te acostaste, meaning you did your homework, you played video games, and you went to bed, meaning you did those three things one after another. And in the imperfect tense, we are going to use it more to describe trends. So, for example, we could say, nosotros veíamos la tele los sábados por la mañana, meaning we watched TV on Saturday mornings. So this is a more general thing. We're not talking about a specific time we watched TV. We're saying it was a trend, that's something that we did often as kids, for example. Going back to the preterite tense, we're going to use it to describe events that interrupted other actions. So in this example, we're going to say, ella llegó cuando ellos leían un libro. This sentence actually contains one verb in the preterite and one in the imperfect. Llegó is the preterite and leían is the imperfect. So in this sentence, which means she arrived when they were reading a book, the word arrived, llegó, is in the preterite. She arrived interrupting them when they were reading a book. The arrival is kind of an interruption and a whole event. If we flip this sentence around, we can look and see how the preterite and imperfect tense work together to describe events in the past. So you can use the imperfect tense on the flip side of that coin to describe events that were in progress or events that got interrupted. So you could say, ellos leían un libro, they were reading a book, cuando ella llegó. So leían in this sentence is in the imperfect because it was in progress when she arrived. Going back to the preterite, we can also use it to talk about events that began or ended. And it doesn't necessarily have to be the words began or ended or started or stopped. You can also imply endings and beginnings. So for example, you could say, yo me desperté, using the preterite tense, meaning I woke up. This sentence is implying that I started being awake and I stopped being asleep. It's a whole event, kind of a change in my state. The imperfect tense, however, is going to describe events that describe the contexts. So, yo tenía 15 años. I was 15 years old. You're not going to say I was 15 years old as your main point. That's not a whole idea. Well, it's a whole idea, but it's not a whole story. You're always going to do something when you were 15 years old. So that's the context for a further story. Similarly, the setting will be described by the imperfect tense. So you could say, hacía calor y sol. It was sunny and hot. This is the setting for a further story. It's something that was ongoing when something else happened, although we don't know what that other thing that happened is. You could often use the imperfect tense to describe appearance. For example, la casa era roja. The house was red. I don't really care when the house started being red or when the house stopped being red. All I care about is that at the time of my story, it was red. And then finally, emotion is often, but not always, described using the imperfect tense. You could say, tú estabas cansado. You were tired. But when you're using this way, you're implying that something else happened while you were tired. You were tired. Tú estabas cansado. So going back to the beginning, if you're ever confused, go back to these general principles. These are really what's going to help you decide if you're going to use the preterite tense or the imperfect tense. The preterite tense describes whole events and limited events, whereas the imperfect tense describes ongoing and habitual events. Hopefully that helped, and keep studying, and I'll see you in our next video. Adios.